Boa tarde.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we are now coming back for our panel number 4. We're close to ending our seminar. But before getting there, let me invite a very important person to talk to us now, because she has been responsible for a great deal of our delays, and she really makes us leave this place later sometimes, and she has given me quite a bit of trouble. Adailde Marinho, if you could please, she is the owner of those cheese buns that were served out there. Good afternoon, my dear friends. Well, I'm sorry here, I'm a little hoarse because I just came out of a very long cold. I'll be good soon. No. Your cheese buns are great, somebody said here in the audience. Oh, you liked it then. That's good. Yes, what's the recipe of your cheese buns? Can you share that with us? No, I'm just kidding. We just want to hear a little bit of your own story. And how did you come here to Inhotim? I mean, this, the wonderful food you cook here. It's really amazing, the job you have done. So, how did you end up arriving here? Well, it's a long way, and it was really about Bernardo Paz believing in me and in the job I can do, and that's why I've been here for 11 years now. And we've had a lot of really big, powerful chefs, and I bet they would like to be here, but still, I'm the one here. Sorry about that. Oh, that's wonderful. And you use a lot of local ingredients, don't you? I mean, we can really feel the taste of Minas Gerais. Yes, the menu we developed here, it was basically, taken from locally sourced ingredients, farmers who were, close by here to the Brumadinho area. And what does, and what do you think the cuisine from Minas Gerais represents to the people who come here visit us? Well, cuisine here in Minas Gerais, it's very comprehensive, and the more things you create, the more you want to innovate. And actually, next year, I intend to write a book called My Heart in a Pen, because the idea is, oh, thank you for that. The idea is really, putting your hands there and make it work, and put your heart also in everything you do. Okay, does anyone have a question here to her? Oh, the recipes for the cheese buns. Well, the recipe for that cheese bun, it's a secret recipe, but it's really good anyhow. So do come back, every day here, because we're going to be serving great cheese buns tomorrow. It's going to be actually better than today, and in 2018, we actually want to be listed as the best cheese buns in the world. I guess you already are. Okay, I guess we have another person here with a question. She's saying, "Oh, but you are a big, powerful chef." And, yeah, isn't that so, people? When we see our ladies, specifically, black women, ahead of things like this, this is really something that makes us really proud, isn't it? That's it. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Well, today then, on behalf of all of our employees here at Inhotim, and also on behalf of Bernardo Paz, and who really allowed me to be a part of the history of this paradise on earth, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Thank you. Yes, so excuse me now. Thank you. Will we have cheese buns in the afternoon? Yes, we will. And this time with some jelly or jam. Yeah. Okay, so let's now start our panel. This is panel number 4. Private sector as a promoter of development, of sustainable development. The purpose of this panel is to exchange experiences from the various spheres of government, and also the private sector in the area of sustainable development. So in this panel, I would like to invite the advisor and representative of the Secretary of the Environment of Minas Gerais, Germano Luis Gomes, a researcher in the area of social environmental conflicts also, Mr. Augusto Henrique Liu Horta. Also a researcher from the Applied Economics Institute and scientific advisor to the Escolhas Institute, Mr. Sandra Paulson. Director of the Department for Climate Change with the Secretary of Climate Change and Environmental Quality from the Ministry of the Environment, a representative in the Interministerial Committee for Global Climate Change and the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change, also a member of the Brazilian delegation in the conferences of the parties involved in the conventions of the UN on climate change. Okay, here we have him, Adriano Oliveira. And also the moderator for this panel, the advisor to the Inhotim Institute and the consultant on the environment and sustainability, who also worked as an executive secretary under the Ministry of the Environment, José Carlos Carvalho. So, okay, session is open. The floor is yours. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say that I'm very happy to be here, and I'm sure that I also speak on behalf of my colleagues. It's really great to be here participating in this last panel, which ends our seminar. And the topic here is rather complex, I would say, as mentioned by our Master of Ceremonies. So the panelists are therefore invited to speak about the public sector as a promoter of sustainable development. As a matter of fact, this panel might very well be considered a summary, specifically when you look at the topics discussed in the previous panels, because all of the things that have been discussed here, in a way and necessarily, have to go through the development of public policies and also by a political decision-making process. So that's the scope of the discussion that is about to be held here after we have obviously heard from each one of the panelists here as they will share with us their perspectives on the topic. Well, at this particular juncture, it is not easy to talk about the role of the public sector in sustainability, and speaking about the public sector as a promoter of sustainable development, specifically at a time in which we know that we have a public sector that is unsustainable. At any rate, this is, again, another challenge we are facing, another issue to be considered and discussed in the presentations that we are about to have. And during lunch, we agreed that we would start with Adriano Santiago. He is the Director for Climate Change under the Secretary for the Environment in the Ministry of the Environment. And because of the various items in his own resume, because he will bring to us an international perspective, and he will try to also connect what is agreed at an international level and the initiatives at an international level concerning climate and the national policies for climate change, and more specifically the Brazilian NDC, which will quite probably be the object of his remarks. So, Adriano, we hope that you might give us some indication as to how the country is organizing now to meet the commitments agreed upon during the meeting in Paris. Thank you very much, Mr. José Carlos Carvalho. Let me also greet my other colleagues here, Sandra and Augusto. And obviously, I have to say here, José Carlos, that I am very proud for having been invited by Inhotim, and I have to thank also the UNDP and the IDB. And it's hard actually not to say that when I first started studying climate change, you were the minister there, in charge of the Ministry of the Environment. So I may say that today I have at least 3 people whom I admire. You, José Carlos Carvalho, Dr. Thelma Krug, and Haroldo Machado, representing the UNDP, among others. I mean, but I would like to at least here greet all of you and acknowledge the great job you have done. So, Mr. Minister, let me then use 2 of the things you said. First off, you're looking at the public sector as a promoter of sustainable development. As you said yourself, we have here today the purpose actually of this session is to try and summarize what was discussed in the previous sessions. And I'm going to talk about the public sector as one of the promoters of sustainable development, because as José Carlos Carvalho said here, the contributions determined here, or the Brazilian international contribution. My idea then is that the NDC, and speaking of our nationally determined contributions, our NDC may be interpreted as an instrument to reorient development in Brazil. And because of that, I would like to stress that as it is a nationally determined contribution, it is not determined by the government. It is nationally determined instead, and necessarily it will have to account in the involvement of not only the public sector but also the private sector, a lot of involvement actually from them, so that this can be implemented from the academia. Also, we had a very interesting panel here on science just before lunch. Non-governmental organizations and Brazilian society, all of them must be imbued with the spirit of implementing our nationally determined contributions. And also following what was mentioned by José Carlos Carvalho, I'm going to try and bring a little bit of the international perspective on this matter. Let me start by showing you a chart taken from the 5th assessment report from the IPCC. And here, Thelma Krug is here with us, so please, Mrs. Krug, if I say something wrong here, feel free to correct me. And I'd like to make reference also to another person, Dr. José Miguel, who's been working also for quite some time in this area. And I brought some charts here because I remembered something that he has mentioned many times. Some people have, an auditory memory, that is, when you say things, people listen to you and memorize, and other people have a more visual memory. So following his guidance, the idea is to bring some charts to encourage discussions. And the first of them is this here. 5th report from the IPCC, the 5th assessment report, brings data from the population data from 1950 all the way to 2010. Obviously, we have more current estimates for that, but I really meant to bring some data from the IPCC since we are discussing climate change and biodiversity. The challenge the world will face is that we had a population, a global population in 1950 of about 2.5 billion people. This number in 2010 went up to something close to 7 billion, so we have an additional 4.5 billion people, and current estimates indicate that we are over 7 billion people today. Urban population, or the percentage of the proportion of urban population populations located in urban areas in South America and the Caribbean, up until 1950, we had just over 40% of the people here living in urban areas in Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2010, this was closer to 80%, which is very close to the numbers here in Brazil, as a country that is a part of this region. And this brings a significant challenge to us around the need to develop infrastructure to meet the requirements of a growing population. Obviously, those other 20% who live out on the field, they are also a driver in the on greenhouse gas emissions. We have lots of a significant amount of agribusiness here in Brazil, and this really poses significant challenges when it comes to the infrastructure needed to support our economic development. And how is the world walking towards this reality? Are we actually being able to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement? And by the way, let me remind you that it basically has 3 main goals. The one that is more widely known by everyone is trying to prevent increases in temperature to go beyond 2 degrees centigrade when compared to pre-industrial levels. and to make all possible efforts to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade and not allow it to go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. But we have another two goals. Since we are talking here, or speaking here in a seminar on climate change and biodiversity, the second larger objective in the Paris Agreement is to increase the adaptive ability and food safety levels of these two things. So there's a strong commitment there in the Paris Agreement toward adaptation. And the third goal is to get financial flows to be consistent with a low greenhouse gas emission pattern, so that we can develop our resiliency. So I think that the Paris Agreement offers for a number of measures in the area of mitigation, adaptation, and funding as well. Today, and this is an important bit of information, we have that this is per capita emissions of developed countries. On average, and here I'm talking about carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuels, and we don't have here forests or agriculture. We're talking about emissions from fossil fuels, and that's really the main source, and that also entails those perverse effects of CO2, which part of which stays for thousands of years in our atmosphere. So we're looking at, I'm not saying that other gases are not problematic, they obviously are, but we're considering only CO2 emissions from fossil fuels in the year of 2008. So per capita emissions from developed nations, and this is the main number here, was of 10 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. The average here for developing nations is of about 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. That is, emissions from developed nations is 5 times larger than that of developing nations. So what does the IPCC recommend in terms of possible paths for the world to limit increases in temperature to 2 degrees centigrade? And here we have data all the way to 2050, when the population will be, greater than, we're going to have more than 9 billion people on Earth. Mean emissions per capita coming from fossil fuels has to be below 2 tons of CO2 per person per year. That is the challenge the world has to basically have the Paris Agreement into effect, is to get developing nations to basically stick to those same emission levels, or possibly decrease the current levels of emissions, and at the same time they should still be able to grow economically and socially. But we have to have a brutal effort from developed nations so that they reduce their emissions also to the levels indicated by the IPCC. And here, I can't read it too much, but the possibility is 50 to 75% of us reaching those 2 degrees centigrade. So it's a complex calculation. It's tough, and Thelma might be able to speak about that in much more detail than I ever could. But next year we're going to have a report issued by the IPCC on the possibility of having an increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we might say that the effort to make it to this 1.5 degrees there has to start now, immediately, because we simply can't postpone that anymore, and we have to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. Another important bit of information from the 5th assessment report issued by the IPCC shows the severity of the issue here, and it also and we have to really focus on these efforts to reach the commitments agreed on in Paris. The growth in emissions, as you can see in this chart here, and I'm talking about aggregate emissions here and CO2 equivalent, and this is also something described by Dr. Krug. This is a metric to compare the heating power of various gases, considering CO2 as a reference, and we're considering here all greenhouse gases, not only CO2, but the growth in emissions between 1970 and 2000 was of about 1.3% a year. In the from 2000 to 2010, that same level of emissions grew by 2.2%. So we left from 40 billion tons of CO2 equivalent to 49 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2010. But this chart from the IPCC also speaks of the relevance of emissions coming from fossil fuels and industrial processes. 65% of those emissions come from fossil fuels. 11% come from carbon dioxide emissions from changes to land and forest, which has a, say, less relevant role in terms of emissions, but it's also an important thing, and Brazil has done quite a bit to try and reduce devegetation. Here we have emissions, methane emissions, and nitrous oxide emissions. Much of this coming from sanitary landfills and agribusiness. And so what does Brazil look like in this scene? Well, let me try and stress a relevant fact here, and this is something that has been observed in recent years. We had a brutal decrease on devegetation rates in the Amazon, and this is data from the INPI. And here I'm going to speak a little about the importance of public policies. Obviously, I mean, here, this is not the outcome of public policies merely. I mean, I have to recognize the role of Brazilian society also in this decrease in emissions. But the fact of the matter is that from 2004, when our rate of devegetation was beyond 27,000 square kilometers, we were able to decrease that rate of devegetation in 2017 to a little bit more than 6.6 thousand square kilometers, which is still a lot, anyhow. I mean, I think the government cannot simply think that the situation looks good by having those numbers. I think that the efforts have to keep on being made. And in this effort to reduce devegetation, there's a lot of command and control here. And this is the data from 2012, when we reached the lowest devegetation rate, just over 4.5 thousand square kilometers. We had a few setbacks here in 2012 and then 2013. In the next 2 years, and then the past 2 years also, we saw a growth in devegetation. But the fact of the matter is that we had a reduction here from 2016 into 2017. So what we have to do here is, yes, indeed, we have to keep up with our command and control efforts, but at the same time we have to do other things in our program to combat devegetation in the Amazon. It's called PPCDM. And I'm sorry if I'm referring too much to Dr. Thelma Krug, but I have to refer to her because, after all, she was ahead of our devegetation efforts in the Ministry of the Environment for the past few years, and this reduction in devegetation is also due to the job done before. This is not the work of one administration or of only 1 year. Also, Jair is also doing a great job right now, but the fact of the matter is that this is the outcome of teamwork, and Thelma was ahead of the fourth stage of the PPC dam, when we have seen significant results being attained here. So this drop in devegetation, what we have here in terms of emissions in Brazil is this here. In 2005, we had 2.1 or 2.2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent being emitted by Brazil as a whole. In 2014, mostly because of this significant decrease in devegetation in the Amazon, we are talking about a level of emissions of 1.2 to 1.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. The reduction from 2005 to 2014, and this is the most recent data that we have from the Ministry of Science and Technology, Innovation and Communication, we had a drop of 40% on greenhouse gas emissions. And I would dare say that no country in this period of time, or a group of countries in this period of time, was able to attain such a substantial reduction on emissions. You should also see that emissions in 2005, in terms of the changes in the use of lands and forests, equals pretty much all of the emissions we had in 2014 for energy, agribusiness, and changes in the use of lands and forests. Once again, obviously we can't stop here. We've been ambitious, obviously, in our emission reduction goals, and this scenario shows the effort the country has made, and even so we were able to be ambitious once again in the Paris Agreement. I'm going to talk a little about our NDC, as José Carlos mentioned earlier. But the fact is that in 2005 we had a predominance of changes on the use of land and forests, accounting for approximately 55% of our emissions. This number dropped to slightly above 18% in 2014. Agribusiness, which accounted for 23%, currently accounts for 33% of our emissions. Energy, which was just slightly above 15%, now accounts for 37%. And the fact that we have to consider here as we look at those numbers is that the drops on use of land and forests was much greater than the growth that happened here on agribusiness, and then the growth that happened here in the emissions made by the energy industry. And those are emissions that promote development. I mean, obviously, we have to try and look for renewable sources of energy and reduce emissions in these areas here too. But the fact is that the absolute growth of emissions in these two industries here was much smaller than the reductions that we got here in the end. And for the atmosphere, what really matters is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and being a little more climate-oriented here, as Dr. Thelma Narod mentioned here in the previous panel.
Now, these figures that Brazil managed to reach in recent years, and once again with the effort of public policies, but also with the help of science, with the help of the private sector, the mechanism of clean development, as Rodrigo mentioned in the previous panel, had a very important very important role in reducing emissions in Brazil. But this did not make Brazil be intimidated and not present a nationally determined and bold offer in the contribution in the Paris Agreement. This is our contribution. The Brazilian goal is to reduce its emissions by 2025 in 37% compared to the basal year of 2005, with an indicative contribution in 2030 of 43% of reduction in its emissions, also based on 2005. So it is an absolute goal vis-a-vis the baseline year, and I would like to stress that Brazil was one of the first developing countries, one of the few developing countries to offer this reduction in absolute terms in emissions. Very few countries did that, and the scope of this reduction would be to the entire economy of the country. This is a very important fact, because I remember that in the Lima conference, Brazil proposed of never go back, always to have a progression in its goal with years. There were concentric circles. We showed that ambition has to be always moving towards the center of the circles and never going back throughout the years, always promoting more bold reductions. And there was one criticism, people saying, well, but Brazil placed this proposal, it didn't work. No, it did work. In the Paris Agreement, there are specific articles saying that the next contributions must be increasingly more bold, which in the Brazilian case is very difficult to do, because you notice that we have reduced significantly. We have the Brazilian population, as we said in the beginning of the presentation, the Brazilian population reached a peak will reach a peak by 2040, and we will need a robust social and economical development to meet this populational demand. And the challenge is to do this going through this path of low greenhouse gases. Low emission of greenhouse gases. Now, what I wanted to bring to you here to end this first talk is that the challenge placed for the Brazilian development is rather complex and difficult. The government has taken some important steps, has built a strategy to implement this NDC. However, this does not mean that we don't have strong movements to reach the goals that have been established. Actually, in the week of the climate change conference in Bonn a few weeks ago, that is, they launched the interministerial ordinance of the Plan of Vegetation Recovery. We have now the Renova Bill, which is an urgent ordinance that will change the way the Brazilian government works with biofuel, especially anticipating goals that we established vis-a-vis the addition of biodiesel to diesel fuel. The forecast or the projections would be 10% of biodiesel in fossil diesel, which was anticipated for March 2018, 15% by 2020, and 20% of biodiesel by 2030. So political guidelines have been given so as to the participation of renewable fuels in our biofuels matrix. For alcohol, for ethanol, we're going from 20% in the gas to 30% by 2022, and it may reach 40% by 2030. So as far as renewable fuels concerned, Brazil is really putting up a great effort. Now, as far as energy is concerned, or power, an example of a strong impact of government actions in the field of renewable energy comes from wind power. From 2010 all the way to 2015, in 5 years, we left an installed capacity which was a bit more than 900 megawatts to something close to 8 gigawatts by 2015. In 5 years, we increased the Brazilian installed capacity 8 times as far as wind power is concerned. A great effort for a country that already has a very renewable energy matrix. We have 42% of renewables in our matrix today. Our NDC goal is to get to 45% by 2030. So this, in the setting of increase in population, improvements in infrastructure, so our effort has to be huge. Of course, we need a debate with the society in relation to that law of fossil emissions. This is something that can be a strong barrier against the contribution that Brazil has established in the Paris Agreement. I'm not saying that with this it will be impossible, or criticizing, making an open criticism here. We need to have a debate with society vis-a-vis the kind of development we want to have. And also considering the different responsibilities we have among the different countries. Now, Brazil put up a contribution, a non-conditional contribution. We did not condition the implementation of the NBC to any international support, which was well seen by the international community, which does not mean that we will not use the financial mechanisms in the convention. We will look for resources. The Green Fund for Climate will continue to look for funds from Jeff. What we can say is that with this proposal of not conditioning it to an international support, if the support comes, we can do even better, and we can do it faster. I saw that my time is up. And also, I would like to leave some time for questions and answers and debates and all. So I will stop here. Thank you. Well, thank you, Adriano. As you have followed, he gave us a bird's eye view of the Paris Agreement, the most current, the most up-to-date initiatives of the Brazilian government to meet our goals, the goals established at the Paris Agreement. We have had some support, as he said, some reduction in deforestation, although this is something that is very polemical. Brazil is insisting on a policy for the Amazon region, very much based on a control and command mechanism, and we should not believe that only with inspection we will end with deforestation, even because the legislation itself allows for some illegal deforestation to happen. So, but I see that we are basically hitting the floor of what we could do as far as reduction is concerned. Using inspection and control. This means that we have to imagine some other means to occupy the Amazon, some other policies for Amazon development that is not exclusively based on the expansion of the agricultural borders in land occupied by forests. So this is a synthesis that I would like to make here. I think that we also have to record what the country has been doing that is good. Adriano brought here everything we're doing, and wind power was not even imaginable 10 years ago, and we are really having a true development in wind power that has been huge, which means a very positive effort to have an energy matrix that is clean, renewable. But I would only like to stress that amidst all this progress, we cannot forget in such a meeting the major pushback, which has been the government attempt to give fiscal exemptions to the fossil fuel power, while the world is moving against it to hit the carbon emission with higher taxes, which is a world trend. Despite all the effort we're doing in renewable power, we are having a fall, a drawback, trying to provide a fiscal exemption in fossil fuel, especially in oil, and an attempt to make the pre-sal unfeasible. That could happen some other way, or to make it feasible, actually, without the need for a fiscal waiving, as is something that the government is doing in the oil field. Now, having heard what Adriano had to say, now we'd like to hear the talk from our researcher Sandra Paulson from the Research Institute of Applied Economy of IPEA. She works very much in this field of the environment. I had the opportunity of working together with her in one of these jobs, and she certainly will add what Adriana has already said, and she will say what we can do at a national level, as well as she will talk about the planning so that we can have the reorientation that Adriana already mentioned. I believe it is very clear. We can have a very summarized view here that we will not be able to reach those goals without a deep change in the development patterns that we have in Brazil today, as we have had in the past decades. I believe this is our challenge, and I yield the floor to Dr. Sandra. Now, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to, first of all, thank Inhotim Institute for the invitation, and I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity to learn, to interact with other people, which is an opportunity we are all having here together. I greet my colleagues, members of the panel here, Augusto and Adriana, and I would like to thank José Carlos Carvalho, the MOC, for the invitation as well. And I would also like to say, since we are here in the last panel of this meeting, that I learned a lot here about botanical gardens and the role they have in this struggle we have to mitigate and reduce the effects of climate change, which is something that is coming to hit us. And I would like also to stress that this panel, I'm not sure if this is a panel of summary, but without any doubt, we should all converge after this, as of this interaction between the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, the population as a whole, because as Adriano said, politics happen at a national level, and there has to be an agreement by all the stakeholders, the state government, the federal government, the local government, etc. Another point that I would also like to stress is my commitment to take what I learned from these 2 days to IPEA, which is an applied economics research institute of studies and creation and management of public policies. So I intend to take the ideas, the visions that I heard and saw here, of all these ideas from Inhotim Institute, take this to IPEA, to our discussions there. I will focus my presentation on two tools, if you will. I'm not an environmental economist, so I'll try to focus my speech on environmental economical management tools which were in use throughout the world, but also here in Brazil it is in use, which are the natural capital accounts and environmental licensing. So I will talk a little about these two tools, if you will, with which we have been working at IPEA and at the federal level. And also after that we'll see how the discussion goes. So I am not sure if you saw, but recently we had approved by the President of the Republic here, Law 3493, which was approved this past October, which establishes exactly that the IBGE should calculate the green GDP, including the national ecological assets in the line of environmental economic accounts that the United Nations have already proposed and that has been accepted as an international pattern. Therefore, we have, legally speaking now, through IBGE, we have this obligation of including natural and environmental resources in our national accounts system in Brazil. This accounts system may progress or not, depending on a number of factors. However, they basically mean data systems, data and information systems, which enable us to look at two things. One, in which way natural capital, the environment, the ecosystems contribute to the economical system for the economical activities that we have in our country and also production in this country. But and also another aspect, number two, is how economical activity impact the environment, the natural resources and environmental resources. So there are internationally accepted methodologies that have been used by the United Nations that, together with the so-called experimental ecosystem accounts, which are also being tried in the one system, they may the United Nations system, which may help us better understand the interactions that happen between the economy and the environment, so that also within the line of what Lucas said in the first day, that we need to understand in order to adopt the proper paths to face all these problems we have been facing. Therefore, these environmental accounts, they are already being worked upon by the IBGE together with the National Agency of Waters. We are counting the water resource in our country. There are already steps taken together with the Forestry Service to establish or to create forestry resources accounts, and there's also an interest, and studies have started to provide us with accounts concerning the energy resources. So this country is progressing also in this direction. Another tool that is also a traditional tool, actually, just to end, I would say that, of course, the best piece of information about this account of environmental and natural resources may also help us better understand how climate change is affecting us and in what way our economical activities are affecting the climate. Therefore, this is one thing that is clear, a clear link between environmental natural resources account and climate change. Now, the second tool that we have, which is environmental licensing, IPEA has just published, actually past August, with this help from Professor José Carlos de Carvalho. They published this book, Environmental Licensing and Territorial Governance, which is the result, the outcome of an international meeting that we organized at about 2 years ago. And This book is available online. If you just put the name there, the PDF can be downloaded. If anyone wants a printed copy, please let me know later, and I may try to send it to you. But anyhow, the environmental licensing, recently there was a piece of news in the Folha de São Paulo newspaper is stressing the increase in the number of requests for licensing throughout the number of 2017, or the year of 2017 rather, and this happens with our hope that this signals a recovery of the economy, an increase in the trust of investors in Brazilian economy. But we also hope that the new projects of railways, roads, infrastructure in general, oil exploration or mining, ports or generation and transmission of power, we hope that these new projects may go through a necessary and mandatory process of environmental licensing that may help the projects themselves to get better and better contribute to the goals that we have in our economy, which are goals of growth, but also well-being, increase in the number of in the number of employment generated, and life quality to all of us. So, environmental licensing is a tool that needs to be taken seriously within this process of planning of our activities, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector. It cannot be one last instance, a bottleneck for investment. It cannot be seen as a problem, as a hurdle for the economy and the development of our country. Therefore, in our book, we state all of this. The licensing is licensing a villain or a good guy? Well, we concluded that it is neither, and it is an instrument of which an instrument that we need to help us select the best alternatives for our economical activities, the setting up of projects and territorial development and so on and so forth. Now, these are the what's my time like? Anyhow, these were these two areas that I wanted to stress and say that we have been working in these two fronts there at IPEA. We are running some studies, etc. And in addition, I have been working with environmental economy for close to 30 years now, evaluating ecosystem services and natural assets accounts. And oftentimes at different moments we hear the same argument. How are we going to do this? We don't have proper methods for this. We don't have the necessary methodology to evaluate, to value properly the environment. These are goods and services. Ecosystem services become goods and services for which we have no markets. So we have a lot of difficulty in properly appraising, and including these goods and services in our design analysis, our policy programs, studies, in our planning programs. And after many years working with this, I concluded that it is not very easy for someone who worked hard trying to evaluate or assign value to different habitats' contribution to fishing, for instance. But we come to the conclusion after some time that maybe we don't actually need so many case studies, in-depth case studies for each type of systemic service for each specific situation. We have many studies throughout the world, and what we can do is, because this also has to do with efforts of mitigation. So if we're going to assess projects, we can adopt standard values for given ecosystemic services. We can make transfers of values and benefits which were calculated for other projects, and in order to see when we can include these in our projects. So there are other options, but we are talking here about the possibility of studying, preparing, and making available catalogs of values for different ecosystems services in different environments of the country, or the planet rather, that may help us come closer to including natural and environmental resources and ecosystem services in our projects. Therefore, we today at IPEA, within a line that the Director of State Institutions and Democracy, there we have an entire research line about state capacity and democracy. This book, for instance, that talks about institutional arrangements of public policies. So I am starting now with a project that I put the title here of "What is the climate for the environment like?" And the goal of this research project is exactly to try to progress in this understanding what are the reasons, what are the mechanisms that make it difficult sometimes to have an integration of all these topics that we saw here throughout these 2 days, which is absolutely paramount. And we cannot we cannot refuse to introduce these issues in our economic analysis. So the project I am working now tries to identify environments and institutional arrangements that may enable or may facilitate the integration of climate change, the loss of biodiversity and environmental problems, the deterioration of ecosystem services that we are facing, how we can better introduce these topics and take our studies, analysis, and policies to make them consider this environment where we are living, in which climate change can no longer be denied. It must actually be quickly included in our analysis. Therefore, in this sense, I believe that we all have to somehow converge to what today there's a website in the internet that you can visit, but there is what we call a new climate economy. And this is what we need, and this is why all the countries are working in this direction. And we should all try to converge to this. We need to understand the changes our world is suffering, and we have to interact with them, adapt ourselves, mitigate them as much as possible. Because, as it was said here, it is not just an issue of protecting and rescuing the planet. The planet will continue with us or without us. I wish we can say the planet will move on. What will happen, and what is already happening, is that we, with our influence, with our activities, we are making the planet enter into what some scientists are calling Anthropocene. In other words, we're talking about a new geological area, the human era, and what we're doing is that we are turning a planet that today serves as our home, as our food, and source of well-being. We are turning this planet into a planet that will no longer be able to provide the goods and services and the very basis for life, of which we all depend on. And this is what it all means, and I believe we are taking broad steps in understanding these processes, and with the hope that we may we may fulfill all the commitments we took on internationally, and IPEA is really working to support the federal government in this. This is what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Sandra shared interesting facts with us, speaking of a central issue, in my opinion, which is the valuation of natural capital. Brazil has one of the largest, say, environmental assets in the world, and I believe that our insertion in the world is very much connected to our environmental assets, or the things that we have here. So we have to know how to use those assets the best or the most intelligent way possible. And she also shared with us a new thought, which is quite important, and it's about the relevance of including our natural assets in our national accounts, the same way as we have to account for the losses of our natural assets, which is again a pressing and most necessary discussion. We've been putting to waste this extraordinary wealth, and as this is something that is not considered by our national accounts, I think that this was a very good comment and an interesting comment to be made here. And also thinking about environmental licensing not as a merely procedural tool, but actually as something that has to be included in our plans, and more specifically, given environmental license that actually enables decisions to implement specific businesses in the country are based in studies that allow you to choose the very best location for those businesses, not simply doing wherever they want it to get done. We have to be able to decide on the very best location for those businesses, so that we can also have, again, the very best technology possibilities in the realm of technology as it pertains to potentially polluting businesses. And I would actually go beyond. I think that if we have today those studies that are in which emissions are not actually analyzed, and obviously those kinds of studies will not meet the needs of environmental assessment in broader terms. So with those comments, let me now yield the floor to Augusto, and he will talk to us a little bit about the his regional experience. We had here an international connection, a national one, and now Augusto was also head of the cabinet and joint secretary of the Secretary of the Environment of Minas Gerais. He is the current special advisor to strategic matters, and he will talk to us about his regional perspective on these topics. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let me first thank you on behalf of the State Secretary of the Environment and Sustainable Development. I'm very glad for being invited to be here. We're happy to be here, actually. Let me also speak why Germano couldn't be here. He was actually ready to be here with you, but during the week he ended up having some political meetings and he couldn't be here. So he decided to, delegate this task to me, which I was very happy to accept because this is a place that I really enjoy immensely, and also because of the fact that I would be able to share some of the thoughts that we have had there in our secretary, and specifically with my colleagues here, Adriano and Sandra, and Jose Carlos, my eternal boss, if you will. In any ship he is in charge of, I can tell you that I would go there and be one of his sailors. Well, none of them have sunk so far, and I'm quite sure that none will. I like to start my presentations and my addresses by making a statement, almost a confession actually, on my own origins and my academic and professional origins. I'm a civil servant with the state of Minas Gerais. I've been working for more than 20 years with the environment, half of my life. But on the other hand, I'm also a lawyer, and I work in the interfaces between constitutional law and environmental laws. A perspective, a point of view is a view from a certain point. So this here obviously will be the point of view from which I will be talking to you as I discuss the public sector as a promoter of sustainable development. Well, I decided to It's nearly a poetical license, and I decided to change the title of my presentation. Instead of thinking about the public sector as a promoter, I thought about it rather to discussing the public sector with you. Oops, sorry about that. As a driver of sustainable development. And why the idea of a driver? Because every time we think about drivers or engines, we think about something that is dynamic, something that is moving, that has energy circulating in it. And what is this dynamic like in the realm of sustainable development? Well, this is a little bit of Sandra's cup of tea, and I apologize if I say something wrong here. Sandra, feel free to correct me. But from the constitutional standpoint, the economy, or the basis from which sustainable development manifests, has as dynamic agents the companies on the one side, and on the other side families and workers. They are the ones who actually drive the system. They are, say, the energy circulating inside that engine, one might say. So you might wonder, what is the role of the state, therefore? What is the role of government in such engine? Well, if we think about the engine in a vehicle, it is pointless for those if those dynamic components are there alone. You have to have a very special function there without which the system will collapse, which is regulating the system, or even saying it better, yes, regulating the system. The engine has to be well tuned up so that it can reach proper speeds and accelerate. And it is from that perspective that I will talk to you about a few things here. And the main role of government in such a dynamic system is a role in regulation, and this is an extremely relevant activity and challenging as well. So why should I say that? Because from the constitutional standpoint, this is the political and social determination we have here. A chapter here in our Constitution, the one on regulating economic order, says precisely that this is the role of the government. The idea is normatizing and regulating economic activity. Very well, then, with that preface, let me then try and go over a few more norms dictated by our federal constitution in reference to sustainable development. On Article 3, we can see here as a fundamental goal in our republic, we have national development. It's very interesting because Minister Carmen Lucia says that in reality all we could need is the first 4 articles of the Constitution, and they are the ones in which we set out the goals that we intend to meet. And then obviously they contain significant challenges also for them to materialize. Also, Article 170, now speaking more of economic order, saying that it is based on the appreciation of human labor and free initiative, and the purpose is to make sure everyone has a dignifying existence according to the rules of social welfare, observing the following principles. We have here defending the environment. And this article here, from the standpoint of interpretation of our constitutional norms, it has a major impact, because this one here, in combination with the famed Article 225, they are actually the basis of constitutional development, and also in our legal order. On one side you have economic development, on the other side you have protection or protection to the environment. So we may therefore consider that sustainable development is a constitutional program, or in other words, it is an obligation of the government of developing public policies to ensure sustainability. And this is what it is. Ultimately, we have to develop public policies that are sustainable and that generate and promote sustainability. Now, looking at it from the standpoint, nearly as if we were trying to categorize the environment, or the legal nature of the environment, as we usually say as lawyers, I could actually leave with you the idea that an ecologically balanced environment is an environment that is something that we consider to be a fundamental right. And why is it a service in a way? Because the state or the government is forced to regulate it. I mean, not because it wants to do it, but because it is something that is determined in the Constitution. And you might say, okay, fine. So constitutionally things look well. It seems to be all there. But in practice, this dynamic system or this driver of sustainable development doesn't operate in such great alignment. Economic development and protection to the environment, in fact, tend to collide all the time. And this is what we have seen. We who are administrators in the environmental area, this is really what we see every day from the time we get to work, and even after we leave, we keep thinking about it, and these possible collisions and conflicts between these two fundamental rights. It's actually interesting to realize, and here I am trying to discuss some of the challenges that I meant to share with you, that these conflicts end up occurring as a result of flaws, and I'm going to use that this expression here, flaws, failure of the executive and also failure of the legislative of basically doing their constitutional job. And in the end, those conflicts tend to be resolved by our Supreme Federal Court, and this is what we call judicialization of public policies. This happens not only in the environment, but also, and possibly more particularly, in the environmental area. The courts are called in to resolve conflicts that the other powers were simply unable to cope with. And here, I'm just to bring you some news here in a decision that we might consider here as a leading case in the tensions and conflicts and in the collisions between sustainable development and protection for the environment. This is an inconstitutionality action written by Judge Celso de Mello, and it basically sets the basis, and it sets the basis for what judiciary, as a as an organ of constitutional jurisdiction and as the guardians of the Constitution, this is what they have established to resolve conflicts between development and the right to an economically balanced environment. It says here, everyone has the right to a well-balanced environment. This is a third-generation right or a new dimension right that assists all humans. It is up to the state and to the collectivity the obligation of preserving and safeguarding the benefits of future generations, and also the trans-individual ownership of the environment. And this is something that cannot be renounced. This makes sure that we are not going to install in the bosom of collectivity severe intergenerational conflicts marked by disrespect to the duty of solidarity that is a duty of everyone in the protection of this essentially important asset that belongs to people in general. Economic activity cannot be exercised out of harmony with the principles that were set for the protection of the environment. It's an extremely important decision, and I've published a number of papers actually on it, and it gives us this very clear idea that we do have a role inside this big engine, more specifically the economic system and also the state. This is Article 225. I've just brought a few fragments of it, the ones here referring directly to biodiversity. I'm not going to read all of it because that would take too much time. But I would like to say to you that in reference to protecting biodiversity, the Brazilian Constitution is incredibly well equipped and structured. We have a number of pieces of legislation that protect biodiversity, not only in terms of species, but also in terms of ecosystems and also their genetics as well. So we have, we do not lack constitutional rulings, and then the question might be, okay, is that enough for you to have a constitution as good as this one? I mean, can it really be that effective? Is it truly translated into concrete public policies, into concrete action? Well, let me share my perspective on this with you. Obviously, it is not enough. It does not suffice to have a constitution with such structure, but I say that it is nonetheless extremely important. With it is very difficult. Without it, I would say this would be simply impossible. And this actually reminds me of of a poem by Carlos Drummond de Andrade. I mean, since we're here in Minas Gerais, and I come from Minas Gerais, and so Inhotim is in Minas Gerais, let me share that with you. And I think José Carlos will enjoy that, because I know that he knows that poem, and he actually repeated that to me many times. It's a wonderful poem, and I'll try to read a piece of it here. It's called Our Times. I think that Drummond's time is still our time, and he says, this is a time of severed men, and we are vainly traveling around and coloring ourselves, and the hours are crushed into dust in the streets. Men are asking for meat, fire, shoes. Laws are not enough. Lilies do not stem from law. So again, about that poetic energy we feel here. With that, let me move on to the more practical portion of my presentation, whose purpose is to show a little bit of the troubles of a state faced with biodiversity protection policies and climate change policies as well. Here in Minas Gerais, we, since 2005, and after José Carlos Carvalho was ahead of the ministry, we had actions in this direction to really protect us against climate change. And we are moving to present day, still trying to develop, above all, that which Sandra referred to in her presentation, which is an instrument to plan such policy. And we are here right now. We were here in this moment in 2015, that after all of that work, we were able to develop a plan for energy and climate change for the state of Minas Gerais, specifically developed by the executive. And within the last 2 years, we've been trying to get it implemented. It is very important also to show that since 2012, we have had a specific line in the budget for adaptation to climate change. And this is something that was also done in 2016 all the way to 2019. And here, let me also share with you some data on our plan for energy and climate change. We can see here the ambitions of Brazil, which are quite remarkable in the state of Minas Gerais, in its own, given its own specificities, is trying to follow along that same path. Well, this is not my area of expertise, but I wanted only to show to you a little bit of the structure behind this plan, which contains guidelines in these various areas over here. It also lists some strategies for regional adaptation, because we all know that we have to start adapting now, immediately. And it also offers some tools, given that it is a public policy, which we are trying to implement right now. A climate observatory, our research network, also a funding system, and the platform here called Climate Gerais, and you can have access to it, by the way. As the priorities here, we have a state plan. Our state plan for climate change includes the organization of initiatives in our territory, also informed decision-making processes, and integrated planning activities throughout the state. And we also have some principles that this plan intends to develop, and one of those principles is biodiversity, as you can see here. Now, in relation to this first part, what is the challenge that I meant to share with you here and bring for discussion? If in the first point the challenge is to my point here is the judicialization of public policies. If the challenge is to change our public policies and to bring environmental decisions once again to the realm of the executive and the judiciary powers, here the challenge is, it's actually a twofold challenge. The first of them is to get to even terms on what climate change means, because in the government, it's not a monolithic structure. I mean, any government is like that, any administration is like that. we are a dynamic system with tensions and counter-tensions, and not all of the agendas of the government can actually see very clearly the relevance of having a public policy concerning climate change. And another important challenge that we also face in this area is turning or making it mandatory the development of policies whose purpose is to improve our adaptive capabilities to climate change as state public policies instead of being public policies of each given administration. This is a challenge that we are facing today. Here in Minas Gerais, we have a plan which the current administration adopted, and we have the challenge now of getting it approved in the Legislative Assembly to thus transform this public policy into something that becomes an obligation of the state instead of the obligation of one isolated administration. Now, when you look at biodiversity, and this is not something that I know a lot of, I am just going to try to bring you some information. I have some colleagues here from the State Forestry Institute who might be able to convey technical information to you much more competently. But the first thing I would like to mention here is the Rural Environmental Registry in Minas Gerais. And what we did here was we were listing pieces of real estate. We tried to establish a network of partners in the state, and we used a CAR as a territorial management tool as we were collecting information on the environment. We have some data here. This is the total number of properties registered with this system, the system we used here. And the numbers you can see there are quite significant. And this tool is of the utmost importance for us because it is from the information collected here that we can manage those different territories in a way to protect biodiversity and to be more effective while doing it. So we have another list of actions here. This is Biodiversity Protection. The agenda here for Biodiversity Protection is led by IEF. We also have here some activities around about getting society involved. We have significant numbers of people here. Nearly 85,000 hectares of land already covered by what we call environmental promotion initiatives. Number of tree saplings produced, a significant number as well. And now we have here some data also in another kind of project that we call social farming and social production. A significant number of trees being produced. I should also mention another project that we have to restore and protect climate and biodiversity systems in the southeast of the Brazilian Atlantic forest. This is something that we're doing in partnership with the IDB. And speaking still about this program, let me share with you some information. We have the involvement of a number of agencies, including the federal government in the form of through the Ministry of Science and Technology, also the Secretary of the Environment here in Minas Gerais and São Paulo, now also UNESCO, the State University of Minas Gerais, and actually HydroX ended up becoming an institution under the State University of Minas Gerais, and the goal is to restore and preserve ecosystem services associated to biodiversity, and also the catchment of or the containment of carbon in forests. And we have investments here close to $5 million in this area. We have an initiative here of building the first ecological corridor in Minas Gerais. This is being developed together with Foundation Biodiversity, connecting the protection forest in Mata do Sossego to Feliciano Miguel Abdala. So this idea of an ecological corridor is of the utmost importance, and we are gathering now some experience on this area. Another interesting initiative that is being carried out here in the area of biodiversity is the Green Scholarship or Green Fund program created by Dr. José Carlos when he was the minister, and this is basically revolves around the payment for environmental services. And we had two calls for bids in 2010 and in 2011. We got this number of people involved. It's not actually that many, but still, It is somewhat significant if you look into it. This is the number of beneficiaries, and this is the number of hectares of land that are currently being protected through this program. I should also mention that after some time, after some complicated times, I should add, because of lack of funds, we couldn't, we had some trouble paying the beneficiaries of this program, but we ended up nonetheless paying more than 15 million reais in 2017 in this program. And the last thing here is the Promata program, which encompasses a number of components such as strengthening conservation units, monitoring, inspection and control, prevention and firefighting, also some coordination and monitoring activities, and also assessment activities around the success of the program, and sustainable developing sustainable activities around those protection areas. It's an extremely complex program which actually has a few things planned to happen in 2018, such as mapping plant coverage, systematic monitoring of biodiversity and the status of conservation of biodiversity, and a number of other things. And I have to remind you that the State Forestry Institute currently manages 92 conservation units, which are shown over here in this map, a geotagged map, so you have an idea of the size of the operation managed by the State Forestry Institute. Now, looking at protection to biodiversity, what is the big challenge that I have seen for the government in this, as it plays a role of being, the regulator, and also the promoter of sustainable development? I think that above all, the challenge is to turn protection to biodiversity into something that is given priority, and into something that is actually covered properly by public policies. And as a member of the administration, I can find no better way of measuring the relevance and the level of priority that a given policy is given than observing how much money is being allocated to such policy. So the challenge here is indeed to be able to find money to manage these assets, which are absolutely important and relevant, that we have here in the state of Minas Gerais and in Brazil in more general terms as well. I can still remember the study that we did at the State Foundation for the Environment about the countries that invest more on the environment, and the benchmark at the time of the study was Canada. And we were looking at the proportion of the Canadian budget that is applied on that. I mean, how much of that do you think was actually spent, at least at the time of the study, for environmental protection? 2%. And they were the benchmark. We here in Minas Gerais, if I'm not mistaken, in 2007, during José Carlos's administration, we were able to reach our top number here, which is 0.7%. And this is really the highest, the peak on this curve of investments since then. So this, and I still remember Minister Marina saying that I spend most of my time here trying to justify my existence among the other ministers. Yes, and that is precisely the challenge for people involved with the environment. Number one, explaining your existence and then turning that into money, into power, into public policies. Last but not least, I'd also like to talk to you about another important dimension in the administration and in government, specifically as it concerns sustainable development, and as we are, say, this engine, which is environmental education. We have here in Minas Gerais an initiative to modernize and revamp our state regulation for environmental education. Minas Gerais actually pioneered the development of a standard and a norm, piece of legislation specifically about environmental education, including it in our environmental licensing processes. And this was done in 2007. That's the first regulation we had on this issue. And still this year, in April of this year, we redesigned and made adjustments to our regulations so that we were able to achieve this goal of developing policies around environmental education. And one of those initiatives, and maybe the most important of them, is re-establishing our interregional committees for environmental education, which are decentralized. They are located throughout the countryside here in our state, and since 2009 they had not been able to meet. So our effort now is revolves around reactivating those offices, which are an important component in our environmental policies. Well, I might also say that the challenge here is getting environmental education within the scope of environmental licensing. We do not want it to be turned into empty advertising. Advertising for the companies applying for those licenses, because we saw that happen many times. Sometimes companies tend to basically make advertising out of it, and as if it were, say, as if they were greenwashing whatever they do there. So the challenge is regulating this activity so that environmental education can truly produce more citizens who are more aware of the need to conserve the environment instead of using it as a marketing tool. We have a number of other actions listed here which have been planned for 2018 concerning environmental education, and I close my presentation with a more general reflection, if you will. I'm a professor of constitutional law, and I have this thing on me because every country I go to, I like to visit the legislature in these countries, and my wife is a physical therapist and she finds it odd, but she still goes with me, and I have seen a lot of parliaments throughout the world. I go there as if I were a tourist, and one of these parliaments really caught my eye. The German parliament, the Reichstag. Very interesting story there.
It was the seat of the German parliament until the Second World War. It was burned on the eve of the Second World War. And then when Berlin became again the capital of Germany, Reichstag was appointed as the seat of the new German parliament. Gathered together, and the architecture really impressed me substantially because the architect, a brilliant architect, there are other works in Berlin, he placed on the Reichstag a glass dome. Who has been there already? It's really worth going. It's a nice place to go when you are in Berlin, a beautiful city, one of the top 5 of among my favorite cities. And then you go up, you climb up, and through the glass dome, the crystal dome, you see, and way down there you see the legislative operating, working. And the message I took from this visit, from this architectural work, is the following. The main challenge we have, not only for environmental policy, but the main challenge is associated with public management. Is transparency. Power is very much afraid of transparency. They fear transparency, and it is very important that we can manage to develop mechanisms that would guarantee the view that us, our view, citizens' view on the public policies that govern us. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you. Well, Augusto also brought us a different view, completing the 2 previous talks that we had. He talks about the experience here from Minas Gerais. He connects what we do in Minas Gerais with the Constitution. He made a very complete summary, as if you will, of how the environmental and economical issues are played together in the Constitution. Actually, our Constitution is very much remembered in the environment in Article 225 that was discussed here by Augusto. But I consider that he mentioned of the the economic issue, and the article that talks about common competencies and competing competencies just as important or even more important than Article 225, because Article 225 alone would not have the power it has without the other commands that are established inside our Constitution. Well, after we finish the talks, the presentations, we will now move on to the Q&A session with the audience. We will use the tactic that has been on use today. We will listen to we'll hear three questions, and then the speakers will answer this group of three questions, and we'll move on from there. Good afternoon. My name is João Meira Neto from the Federal University of Viçosa. Thank you for your presentations. A question I have for all of you is, well, Brazil, in the last decades, Brazil developed a huge capacity to do research and generate knowledge and train people on biodiversity. Brazil really reached very high levels of quality on this field, not only qualitative but also quantitative. And it is increasingly more evident that biodiversity is one of the best solutions we have to mitigate global warming, and as a solution for carbon sequestration as a planet forests and biofuels. And my question would be, what is the role of the public sector in fostering or promoting projects that use the huge potentials of biodiversity knowledge generated in Brazil and the mega diversity we have in Brazil? Good afternoon. My name is Maria Eugenia, and well, first, thank you very much for your talks, for your presentations. This talk about this association between the economy and the environment. And I have a question here I have had since the very beginning of this meeting, and at many points I wanted to say something, but my question kind of changed throughout all the talks, and now I know why I kept it to the very end, because this might actually be an invitation, as many invitations have been made here, an invitation to understand at the end of the meeting what are the issues that should be discussed in a second meeting or another place where we'll gather together again. And this issue has to do with preservation and the forests and the preservation of forests, and I came this morning. I once again read a number of studies I had done some time ago about the Indian black land, which there are many studies, many interests of the scientific community concerning the soil of the Amazon forest, and also the conception that the Amazon forest is a heritage that has been left by the Indian communities to us. It is a heritage that we might never, as a society, be able to properly work in. In other words, to invest and to have an even richer soil for future generations. And I say this to you because I fail to understand, and I'd like to hear your opinion on that, and especially those who have been here. I fail to understand the cultural dimension of conservation, or even the handling. What you call resources in the use of the use for some. And I think, what does it mean to think about the Amazon forest as something that has been made or created for something that is explored as it is necessary, as a policy of territorial governance, to use a word that I have just learned. But will we be able to learn from this? And I'd like to know if in the scientific and academic medium and political medium, if there is this connection between, Indian struggle and all this indigenous struggle and all this discussion about climate change. And I wanted to discuss this further and, to see what is happening. Well, what we see today is that unfortunately many people still think that sustainable development and environmental protection goes against economical development, as it was very well said here, and both things can and should walk hand in hand. And my question is for Adriano. You talked about the goals that we have in Brazil to reach, and you talked about deforestation for prevention and contention and containing deforestation and development of sustainable means of generating power. And I'd like to know if there's any measure that is being practiced today, anything that is being practiced today that would bring the two things together, sustainable and economical development working together. And my humble view of a student, one of these measures would be the carbon market. Would there be any other measure similar to this one following the same logic? Well, 3 questions for our speakers, and Dr. Augusto has a commitment now. He has a commitment in Belo Horizonte. He will have to go there. He has to teach this evening. He'll be the first to answer, then he can leave for his class. He has this previous engagement, and then we follow with Adriano and Sandra. Well, thank you, José Carlos. Not only a class, it is a final test, so my students are also very anxious about it, and I don't want to be late to get to class tonight. But the first question is about the role of the public power as a promoter of research in biodiversity. I believe the role of the government is really full and very broad. It is part of the public and of the environmental public office as a regulator in its broad sense. And the more research the public power can promote in this field, the better, because we will have academic personnel properly trained and in proper number and quantity and quality, not to let our biodiversity heritage get lost and be decimated at the rates that it is happening today. So all these public policies are, I would say, broadly necessary. And once again, we need money. We need money, we need budget, we need to raise these public policies to the degree of priority that they deserve. And I sometimes think that the environmental issue maybe it may occupy, to use an IPCC scenario technique, it would be the 5th or 6th priority because there are so many other public policies that end up having a closer priority and wait for the cost. But I believe that this cost will be diluted over time. And the second question from Maria Eugenia. Maria Eugenia is, I'm very happy to have you here at Inhotim. And I'd like to say the same thing to Lucas. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much. You're behind the plants, right? But anyhow, the indigenous issue, that is a very interesting question. And I have to tell you that I was not ready for this question, but I will try maybe to actually I'll make a statement here, rather a confession. Of everything I know about the indigenous culture, I learned that the pre-understanding, pre-comprehension is so much different than ours, that this relationship with the space is so completely, I would even say, sacred and ours is not, that it is even difficult to think about how we can manage any heritage, any asset, not only the Amazon, but any other, based on these principles that the indigenous cultures bring us, and which are always, marginal, if you will, from the viewpoint of the official system of power. I myself have dedicated to study, and I have tried to employ this in my life. I haven't been happy I haven't managed to do so, but I keep on trying. But somehow it goes through all Latin American indigenous culture, which is this issue of living well, and we are very far from this concept, Maria Eugenia. The Constitution, with its best intentions, well, comes close to this idea of well-being. But well-being is very different from living well, So I think that I might not have answered your question, but at least I shared my anguish with you. Sandra. Well, from my seat of an economist, I have to say that I have some difficulty in answering these. I may share my concerns as well. One of the things that I commented here is that this issue of economical valuation, which is a topic that has brought about a lot of discussion and research effort and investment of time and resources. Still, we are here talking about economic valuation. We have a spectrum of values that must be considered when we're talking about environmental policies and climate change policies. The community values, energy values, biophysical values. There are many other ways of valuing and measuring value which are not being considered here, not by theory nor by practice of the economy. And I truly don't have an answer as to how we could do it. For example, concerning biodiversity that Sean talked about, we tried to add the biodiversity system when we talked about ecosystemic services, because in the head of an economist, biodiversity comes in as an element that is part of an ecosystem, and the ecosystem comes in as a provider of certain inputs, goods and services for the productive process, or as a receiver of the leftovers of the economic activity. So this is our still very limited field of economy vis-a-vis the environment. So it is a work that is being done. It's been ongoing for about 30 years now, but the idea is to establish this link, this bridge, this dialogue, if you will, which is a dialogue between biology, systems ecology, anthropology that Maria Eugenia talked about, sociology and economy, so as to make this link and add to this necessary link that Thelma talked about, which is this link between science and our practice of life, our public policies, our actions, and our daily lives. I'm an optimist, and I think that slowly we will get there. We are a field, but we are joining forces, and we'll become dangerous. And I think this is it. I don't actually know how to answer this better. People, I apologize. I ask for your forgiveness, and I wish for a good end of seminar. I have to leave. We will have no time for a second round of questions, as we wish we had, because our time is up. So I now yield the floor to Adriano, who will answer the questions that he has and make his final remarks. Thank you, José Carlos. Well, starting from João, research, knowledge generation, biodiversity. I thank you for your question because it gives me this opportunity to talk about a topic I didn't really approach. I talked about mitigation, the effects of greenhouse gases, but biodiversity is something that should be seen as a priority when we think about adaptation to climate change and as a solution, as you said, to protect the climate system. And I would dare say, and I believe the purists in adaptation don't like hearing this, but the reduction in deforestation, this huge deforestation that we have seen here, once again, we should never stop. We have to reduce it even further. But this means of mitigation is the ideal way to adapt also, because we're talking about two things. We're protecting the when we protect the forest, we're also protecting the biodiversity. The role of the public power, the Brazilian government created together with the society, together with the ministries, the National Plan of Adaptation, where this issue of biodiversity protection is a priority. We are talking today about a country program for the Green Climate Fund, the GCS, and we have seen a great movement of the society towards trying to find funds at GCS for adaptation, not only mitigation, and GCF within its rules makes sure that, of course, this is not valid for the entire country, but it's a general rule. 50% of the resources are for mitigation, 50% of the resources are for adaptation, and we have to use this IBD Fund for the Climate as an important tool to promote adaptation actions as well. About this scientific issue, I repeat what Dr. Thelma said in the previous panel. I believe the Ministry of Science and Technology, Innovations and Communication, they have this role of stimulating students and professors to publish more, and then we have the group 2 from IPCC. They deal with the impacts of climate change and adaptation to its effects, and we have to publish more and bring the research community to a further participation on this topic. Now, talking about research, I now move on to Ana Carolina's question and tell you that the opinion of a student is never humble, Ana Carolina. It's quite the contrary when the government starts to listen more to our scientific community, listen more to our educational stakeholders. We will be in a better path to promote this marriage between sustainable development and economical development. As to the goals we have, and here I'd like to talk about some of the measures we may take besides the mechanism of clean development, which is very important. We will have this new mechanism after the Agreement of Paris, which is the Sustainable Development Mechanism, Article number 6 of the Paris Agreement. As the Brazilian government sees, this mechanism must be very similar to that mechanism of clean development. But I wanted to give you two examples of actions that we may undertake and then have the environment and economy working together. One, as I said, is this program for biofuel. And when you talk about deforestation and energy and now bringing agriculture, Nova Bio takes these three dimensions. We'll have a very interesting mechanism in Nova Bio, which will be the creation of titles that may be transferred from the fuel distributors to coming. These titles come from the reduction of emissions that they will have to comply with, vis-a-vis the producers. So the certificates or credits will be generated to foster this type of action. And this is something very important that we see happening in this field of renewable sources and also in the agriculture. At the MDC, we have a very important challenge to promote 12 million hectares of forest recovery and reforestation. Once again, we're talking about the private industry with commercial forests and the reforestation of native areas, indigenous areas, and even the issue of promoting a forest-free economy will be very important. Now, the question from Maria Eugenia about indigenous communities. Just like Augusto, I was not prepared for this. My field in the ministry is not specifically this field of deforestation, indigenous communities, but as a representative of the ministry here, what I can say is that we have made important improvements in strengthening the indigenous community. CONAHED, which is the National Community of HEAD, has the representation of indigenous communities as well as the states and other industries. The Brazilian RDC recognizes indigenous communities, and the main portion of NDC, not only in the information but the main part, indigenous communities as an important part of the actions to fight deforestation. And we had here in the Bonn meeting an important result, which was the indigenous platform. Of course, in the conference, decisions are complied by the countries, but innovation, this platform does not only belong to the parts or to the parties. It is also open to other industries and also the indigenous communities to participate. And the very workshops that I talked about of the Green Fund for the Climate, the Ministry of Treasure that has been coordinating together with the support from the Ministry of the Environment. We had the first GCF workshop specific for indigenous communities. We had other two now with the indigenous communities, and we made sure that in all other workshops that took the agriculture part, power and infrastructure, that would have representatives from the indigenous communities. Because as you said, if we don't listen to the community that managed to preserve the forest, if we don't follow this example, the government will fail in its forestry protection policies. And I'd like to end here, considering the final words here, Minister José Carlos, and talk about an important thing that Augusto said here. And as a chemical engineer, I will not have the support of the lawyers to repeat as he said here. But this issue of economic activity cannot happen in out of sync with the environment. To bring this environmental decision to the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. I lived through these few years. I worked in the Brazilian state, and I can tell you that the climate change policy is a policy of the state and not the government. And we managed to do this, keeping people in different positions, different ministries, different institutions. But there is a core of people coming from back there, which are very important for the policies of climate change. Of course, we have to have an institutional culture. Without any doubt, institutions have to be strengthened, and we have to leave the legacy to those people who would come afterwards. But institutions are made up of people, that without any shadow of doubt. And what we have felt recently is a retrograde movement of removing this issue of the environment from being central in the policy of climate change from many sectors, not many industries. I'm not talking about only one industry here, but we have felt a strong threat. The Ministry of the Environment is being threatened to run some of these policies. We have had the support from society, from other ministries, from the academia to reach these important results, but we have felt this issue of trying to remove the environment, the Ministry of the Environment from these discussions. Our minister has carried out important efforts to prevent this from happening, but I would really like to say here, this is a huge concern we have, and I'd like to have your support from all sectors of society to keep the environment as central in this issue of climate change, because when we talk about trying to avoid the growth of the increase of 2 degrees Celsius in the global temperature by the end of the century, this puts the environmental issue in the very core of everything. And we said, and as a representative of the Ministry of the Environment, climate change is not only environmental issue, it is an issue associated with development. However, the environment has to be in the very center of all these policies. I just wanted to use some some of your patience to make two advertisements that I wanted to make here especially for our colleagues of the panel. The National Fund of Climate Change, we have an important partnership with the Inhotim Institute, and here I thank Lucas and the very ministers, José Carlos Carvalho, with the Climate Fund, an important project to recover degraded areas from mining operations, with reforestation for important data vis-a-vis these issues. We also have with IPEA, we have a technical cooperation involving private and public accounts, as Sandra said, and also changes in climate change. This is very important in the work we have been doing with IPEA. And finally, unfortunately, Augusto had to leave, but we have a project at GAF together with Peludi, who is here representing Peludi, Haroldo is representing Peludi, also with the government of Minas Gerais and also the Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Communication, Ministry of Development, Industry and Commerce, and the Ministry of the Environment of Sustainable Steelworks, and this partnership between the federal government, the state government, and other institutions. And I really wanted to say this. It's very important to mention our partners here today. Thank you. We'd like to thank you all for participating in this final panel. I'd like to invite now the Vice President of Inhotim's board, Clélio Campolina, and I'd like also to use this opportunity to invite you to stay here. After this talk, we will have a presentation from the School of Chord Instruments, which will be a very special presentation. From the strings school. I will be very brief. Good afternoon, everyone. While they prepare the stage here, I would like to first, on behalf of our board, the Board of Administration of Inhotim, I'd like to thank you all for participating, especially our speakers and members of panels and panelists, many of them who came from abroad to help us on this debate. I would like to thank all the participants from Brazil. I'd like to thank the public in general for participating here. And most especially, I would like to thank the organizers from Inhotim for making this event possible. On behalf of whom, I mentioned Lucas here, who was the main organizer, Laura, who spared no efforts for us to have an excellent meeting. As an economist by training, and at the end now, this economic issue came to the surface. I was very excited. I spent 40 years in a university working with development, working with regional development, but the environmental issue was not central to my debate. But now I am fully convinced that the economists throughout history dealt with this topic of economic development in a horizon of growth and economic development. For me, development is something that needed to happen, not only in the material dimension, but also involve the symbolic dimension, and that of art, culture, and nature, and sustainability. I think this is a topic that we economists, we have the responsibility, and I heard here, responsibility towards it. I heard Sandra, and I now would like to say I am an advocate of this cause. We have to think about development in a broader sense, development to reach the well-being of humanity, not only for economic growth. So these variables need to be added, and a meeting like this here is a huge opportunity to bring this to the table. We live today a capitalist development that only created the concentration of wealth and the concentration of poverty. So we are seeing these most traumatic human experiences of mass migrations looking for physical survival. On the other hand, we had a recent experience of socialism, a regular socialism that, despite the discourse of ideology of social justice, this socialism was not able to create a project of a social organization with sustainability. So I am fully convinced that right now, today, humankind is looking for new patterns of political and social organization that may be able to culminate with to involve the material dimension, material well-being, the symbolism, art, culture, nature, and also in which the issue of sustainability is vital, central, and thus it has to be incorporated to the topic of the economic debate of our professional as economists. So we are living without any precedence of a scientific and technological race. All of us who are working with this, I had the opportunity, after having been a professor for over 40 years, I spent 9.5 months as a Ministry of Science and Technology following what is happening in the world. The level of resources being spent with science and technology in the world guided mainly to support competition, economic competition, political competition, military competition, geopolitical competition. And this brings to us a huge challenge that the literature calls scientific and technological Gnosticism, as a totally belief in science and technology. This is great. Science and technology is excellent, but science and technology need to serve the well-being of humans, not only to compete and destroy, right? And this is the settings we live in today. And I would like to end saying that Inhotim, which was built in a degraded area, 34 years, this was a mining operation. This entire region was explored. It was a degraded area. It was built here. It didn't start here. Inhotim started during the 80s, this recovery. And here I would like to state for the record and thank the visionary contribution from Bernardo Paz. Bernard Paz, he built Inhotim with his own resources from his own companies, which was something of a private and personal use for him. And later on, he opened this to the public, and in February of 2017, he donated Inhotim to the state. So Inhotim is now a public, is a public park, but not governmental. So we have to recognize and acknowledge the work of this visionary entrepreneur who employed his resources to give this asset to humankind. And Inhotim is really a seed of what we need to build a new pattern of social and political organization that would point to the well-being of humankind, and not only for military, political, and economic competition. Thank you.
Ainda tem coisa para falar.
Right, we still have some things to say here, if you could please wait a little. So we're now moving toward the very end of our meeting. Those have been really 3 wonderful days with you, and really great discussions, people coming from all over the world. I don't even have to say that again, because after all, you were here, and this was really a special gathering. Also the people who saw the broadcast there live, and we will soon have some wonderful cheese buns again, or at least I hope so. We're going to have a cocktail party later on, and you're all invited to join us and enjoy this cocktail party in which we close our meeting. And now we are going to watch a very special performance by the String School, or School of Strings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about their story. Since 2012, the String Schools of Inhotim is offering kids aged between 10 and 18 years of age living here in Brumadinho the opportunity of learning theory and practice how to play string instruments, viola and violin, and also cellos. And today we have 90 members in this process, and a number of those students, those at least who develop more musically, they end up becoming a part of the young orchestra of Inhotim, and they perform in stages here, and obviously this increases the references of these students as they have contact with concert music, and obviously that contributes a lot also to recognition and appreciation of the musical scene of the Paraopeba River Valley. So this is really wonderful work. The School of Strings in Inhotim is sponsored by Vale, and with our Federal Law of Incentive to Culture, and they're going to perform now to us. They will play actually two songs, Carinhoso by Pixinguinha and Melodia Sentimental, which is part of the Floresta do Amazonas works by Villa Lobos. So enjoy it, and we'll see you later in the cocktail party. Bye-bye.
noite, ardendo o meu sonhar. As asas da noite que surgem e dormem no espaço profundo. Ó doce, amada, desperta, vem dar teu calor ao luar. Quisera saber-te minha na hora serena e calma. A noite confia ao vento o limite da espera, quando dentro da noite proclamam teu amor. Acorda, vem olhar a lua que brilha na noite escura. Querida, és linda e meiga, senti teu amor e sonhar.